I was 3 Roadhouse coffees deep when the phone rang at 2:47 a.m. The sound cut through the dead silence of the pub's staff quarters like a blade through canvas. I'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and listening to the road trains grinding through their gears on the highway outside, but when that shrill ring started up, something in my gut twisted hard and tight. "Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was professional, careful, male. The kind of tone that comes with bad news and official responsibilities. "Yeah, that's me." I sat up in the narrow bed, bare feet finding the cold linoleum floor. My hand was already shaking, though I couldn't have said why. "This is Senior Constable Ryan from Kondinin Police. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news about your parents." The words that followed came in fragments. Head-on collision. Drunk driver running a red light. No survivors. I doubled over on the edge of the bed, pressing the phone so hard against my ear that the plastic cut into my skin. The constable kept talking. Something about arrangements, about next of kin, about procedures that needed to be followed. But all I could think about were my brothers. "Where are Jake and Tommy now?" I managed through the tightness in my throat. "They're with Mrs. Henderson next door. She's been looking after them since this evening. Sarah, I need you to know that given their ages, child services will need to be contacted in the morning." The line went quiet, except for static and the distant hum of the highway. I stared at the wall where someone had pinned up roster sheets and a faded photo of last year's Christmas party. Dad and Mum had been driving back from Perth. His specialist appointment for the back problems that had been getting worse. They'd planned to be home by 10 o'clock. "Sarah, are you still there?" "I'm coming," I said, the words scraping against my throat. "I'm coming now." I threw clothes into my duffel bag without looking at them. Jeans still stiff with dried beer from last night's shift. Work shirts that smelled like cigarette smoke and kitchen grease. The cardigan Mum had knitted last winter, soft blue wool that she'd spent weeks getting just right. My fingers kept fumbling with the zipper, and I had to stop twice to wipe my eyes clear. The constable had given me Mrs. Henderson's number. Told me to call before I drove out, make sure someone would be awake. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my lap, staring at the numbers I'd scrawled on the back of an envelope. My hand was shaking so hard I had to dial twice. "Ah, love." Mrs. Henderson's voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry." "How are they?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "Tommy cried himself to sleep about an hour ago. He's in Jake's room. Wouldn't let go of his brother's hand." Jake's not talking much. He's just sitting in my kitchen, won't go to bed. They keep asking when you're coming home." I looked around the cramped room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale beer, the single window that looked out over the pub's car park, the narrow bed with its thin mattress and scratchy sheets. I'd been saving money here for 18 months, planning to maybe do a course in the city. All of that felt like someone else's life now, someone else's dreams. "Mrs. Henderson, what did the police tell you about what happens next?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her breathing and the distant murmur of a television. "We need to talk when you get here, love. Just drive safe. The boys need you." The 3-hour drive to Kondinin passed in a blur of headlights and empty road. I kept the radio off and the windows cracked, needing the cold night air to keep me sharp and awake. Every time I blinked, I saw flashing lights. Twisted metal. The constable's grave, sympathetic face, delivering news that changed everything. The speedometer crept past the limit more than once, but I forced myself to ease off the accelerator. Getting pulled over wouldn't help anyone. Getting killed in my own accident would leave the boys with no one at all. I pulled into Mrs. Henderson's driveway as the first grey light touched the horizon. Her kitchen window glowed yellow against the dawn, and I could see her moving around inside. Probably making tea. Probably wondering how to explain the world to 2 boys who'd lost everything in the space of a phone call. Dad's work boots were still by our back door. Mum's herb garden was neat and precise along the fence line. Everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left for the pub job 18 months ago. As if the world should look different somehow. As if tragedy should leave visible scars on familiar places. Tommy hit me like a small missile as soon as I walked through Mrs. Henderson's door. His arms wrapped around my waist with desperate strength, his face buried against my stomach. He was crying again. The silent kind of tears that meant he'd worn himself out with the loud ones. His hair was sticking up at odd angles, and felt greasy under my hand, like he'd been running his fingers through it all night. "Hey mate," I whispered, running my palm over his head. "I'm here now. I'm here." Jake looked up from the kitchen table but didn't move from his chair. At 12, he was trying to be the man of the house already. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd positioned himself between Tommy and the door like a guard dog, but his eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and when he tried to smile at me his bottom lip trembled. "Mrs. H made pancakes," he said, as if this was crucial information. "They're still warm." "That's good," I said, though the thought of food made my stomach clench. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." She looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Her grey hair was escaping from its usual neat bun, and her face was drawn with exhaustion and grief. She'd known our parents since before Jake was born, had probably held each of us as babies. "Come on, love, sit down, we need to talk." The conversation happened in whispers while Tommy dozed against my shoulder and Jake pretended to read a comic book. Mrs. Henderson laid it out in careful, gentle words, but the meaning was brutal and clear. With Mum and Dad gone, the boys were legally orphans. Child services would place them in foster care, while relatives were contacted and assessed. There was an aunt in Adelaide, Dad's sister Linda, who'd married money and moved away from the wheat belt as fast as she could. She'd sent Christmas cards every year, but hadn't visited in over a decade. Some cousins in Queensland that I barely remembered from family weddings. Distant connections who might take the boys out of duty but would never love them the way they deserved. "But I'm their sister," I said, keeping my voice low so Jake wouldn't hear the panic in it. "I'm 19, I work full-time, I can look after them." "Oh, love." Mrs. Henderson reached across to squeeze my free hand, her fingers dry and warm. "You're not a legal guardian, you're barely an adult yourself in their eyes. And even if you applied for custody, the process takes months, sometimes years. So what, they just get split up, sent to strangers? The system tries to keep siblings together, but I could hear everything that single word carried. Foster families who could take 3 children were rare as hen's teeth. Emergency placements were temporary by definition. The boys would disappear into a bureaucracy that saw them as case files, instead of kids who liked Vegemite sandwiches and Saturday morning cartoons. Jake's comic book rustled as he turned a page, but I caught him watching me over the top of it, listening to every word despite our attempts at keeping things quiet. His jaw was set in the stubborn line he'd inherited from Dad. "When will they come?" I asked. "The caseworker said sometime this morning, maybe around 10. I looked at the microwave clock, glowing green in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. 6:15 a.m. Less than 4 hours before strangers would arrive to collect my brothers and take them away. Less than 4 hours to figure out how to keep our family together. I spent the next 2 hours learning details I should have known already. Tommy's favorite cereal was Nutri-Grain, but only if you added extra milk to make it soggy. Jake's inhaler was in his school bag, and he needed it after running or when he got really upset. The name of their doctor in Kondinin, their teachers, their best friends, all the ordinary pieces of their lives that would need to be packed up and redistributed to people who didn't know them at all. At 8:30, I walked across the yard to Mum and Dad's house. Our house. The keys felt foreign in my hand, too light somehow. Like they should weigh more after what had happened. The silence inside was absolute, not just quiet. Silent in the way that happens when a place stops being lived in. Everything was exactly as they'd left it the morning before. Breakfast dishes still in the sink, coffee rings on the kitchen table. The TV guide folded open to Tuesday's programs that they'd never watch. A load of washing sitting damp in the machine because no one had been there to hang it out. I found the box of important papers in Dad's wardrobe, tucked behind his good shoes and the suit he only wore to funerals. I sat on my parents' bed, still unmade, still smelling faintly of Mum's lavender soap, and went through everything with shaking hands. Birth certificates in careful plastic sleeves, insurance policies with premium notices still attached. The will they'd had drawn up when Jake was born, naming me as guardian if anything happened to them. But I'd been 17 then, still a minor myself. They'd never updated it after my 18th birthday, probably never imagined they'd need to. At the bottom of the box, I found the folder about Uncle Ray's place. Dad's older brother had died 2 years back, leaving his property near Corrigan to Dad in his will. They'd talked about selling it, but land prices were down, and the old homestead needed work that would cost more than they'd ever get back. The folder contained everything: keys, survey maps, even some faded photos of the old station homestead, surrounded by red dirt and scrubland. I spread the photos across Mum's flowered bedspread, staring at Uncle Ray's place like it might hold answers. The house looked solid enough in the pictures, weatherboard and iron, in the style of the old wheat farmers. 40 kilometers from the nearest town. Isolated enough that no one would think to look for us there, at least not immediately. The idea was crazy. Kidnapping, probably, in legal terms. Definitely illegal. But as I heard a car door slam in Mrs. Henderson's driveway and saw the government plates through the bedroom window, I made my choice. I stuffed the folder and all the important papers into my old school backpack. Grabbed clothes from the boys, rooms without worrying about what matched what. Jake's inhaler from his bedside table, Tommy's battered teddy bear from under his pillow. Everything I could carry that might make them feel less lost in whatever came next. Dad's old utility truck was parked in the shed behind a stack of fertilizer bags and rusty farm equipment. The battery was flat from sitting unused, but I'd learnt enough about engines growing up here to get it started with jumper leads. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing black smoke before settling into its familiar rumble. Mrs. Henderson saw me coming and met me at the fence line between our properties. Her face was pale with understanding and worry. "Sarah, love, you can't do this. I won't let them be split up." I kept my voice low but firm. "Jake, Tommy, get in the truck, now." "Where are we going?" Tommy asked, but he was already moving toward the passenger door. Still trusting that his big sister had answers, even when those answers might be completely wrong. Jake hesitated, looking toward Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, where I could see a woman in a beige suit setting up papers on the table. Official papers. Forms that would divide my brothers into case numbers and placement categories. "Sarah, there's a lady here to see us," he said quietly. "I know. That's why we're leaving." Something in my tone must have convinced him, because he climbed into the cab without another word. His comic book was still clutched in one hand, but his knuckles were white where he gripped it. "This will only make things worse," Mrs. Henderson whispered urgently. "They'll call the police. They'll think you've lost your mind." "Maybe I have." I hugged her quickly, breathing in the familiar scent of her soap and the biscuits she was always baking. "Thank you for everything you've done. Look after yourself." "Sarah." But I was already reversing out of the driveway, gravel spinning under the truck's worn tires. In the rearview mirror, I saw the caseworker appear in Mrs. Henderson's doorway, a middle-aged woman with short hair and sensible shoes talking rapidly into a mobile phone. Calling in the cavalry, probably, reporting that the Henderson children had just been abducted by their own sister. As we drove past the intersection where the tow truck was loading the wreckage of our parents' car, Jake turned to watch it disappear behind us, the twisted metal and shattered glass that had held everything we used to be. "Are we in trouble?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the cab of the truck. "No, mate," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "We're just going somewhere safe while I figure things out." The first hour on the road passed in relative quiet. Tommy fell asleep against Jake's shoulder, exhausted by grief and confusion, and the early morning wake-up. Jake stared out the window at the familiar countryside rolling past, wheat fields stubbled from harvest, windmills turning lazily in the morning breeze, farmhouses set back from the road behind stands of pepper trees. I kept to back roads, avoiding the main highways where police might already be watching for us. The truck's engine ran rough but steady, and for a while I let myself believe we might actually make it to Uncle Ray's place without being caught. We stopped at a roadhouse near Brookton, where I bought sandwiches and drinks with cash from my pub wages. The woman behind the counter barely looked at us, just another farm family heading somewhere, nothing worth remembering. I paid quickly, and avoided eye contact, though my heart was hammering against my ribs the whole time. Back on the road, I tried to explain our situation to Jake while Tommy dozed between us. The words came out in fragments. How the government wanted to split us up. How Aunt Linda in Adelaide barely knew us but might take one of them. How foster families were strangers, who'd see them as temporary problems to be managed. "We can't just hide forever," Jake said. "He was too smart for his own good, always had been. Got that from Dad," along with the stubborn streak and the way he chewed his bottom lip when he was thinking hard. Not forever, I agreed. Just until I can get legal advice. Figure out how to make them understand we need to stay together. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching a mob of sheep move across a distant paddock like clouds of dirty wool. What if they find us? He asked finally. They won't. I hoped I sounded more confident than I felt. Uncle Ray's place is pretty remote. We'll be fine there for a while. But the truck had different ideas. The temperature gauge had been creeping upward for the last 20 kilometers, and now steam was beginning to seep from under the bonnet. White wisps at first, then thick clouds that forced me to pull over on a stretch of road that seemed to extend endlessly in both directions. Why are we stopping? Tommy woke up cranky and overheated, his hair plastered to his head with sweat. Just a quick break, I lied, popping the bonnet and stepping back as steam billowed out in hot, choking clouds. The coolant reservoir was bone dry. I could see at least 2 places where the old rubber hoses had split, coolant bleeding out onto the road in dark stains. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with half a bottle of warm water, a packet of stale biscuits, and 2 boys who were counting on me to have answers I didn't possess. Jake climbed out and assessed the situation with the same serious expression Dad used to get when examining broken machinery. He walked around the front of the truck, hands clasped behind his back like a miniature mechanic. "Radiator's stuffed," he announced with authority. "Yeah, I can see that." I tried to keep the panic out of my voice, but it crept in anyway. We were completely exposed here. If police were already looking for us, a breakdown on an empty back road was probably the worst possible scenario. And the heat was becoming unbearable, the kind of dry, pressing heat that could kill you if you weren't careful. Tommy was already red-faced and whimpering, small tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. I realized I was going to have to make some hard choices about our limited water supply. Save it for drinking, or try to get the truck running again. In the distance, I could hear the rumble of a heavy vehicle approaching. The sound grew steadily louder, and soon I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots. The road train emerged from the heat haze like something out of a fever dream. Chrome bull bar glinting like silver in the harsh sunlight, 3 trailers stretched out behind the cab like the segments of some enormous metal snake. My first instinct was to grab the boys and hide behind our truck, but there was nowhere to go in this flat, scrubby landscape. The massive vehicle began to slow, air brakes hissing and sighing as it pulled over 50 meters ahead of us. Dust swirled in the backdraft from its passage, gritty and fine in my mouth and nose. "Stay close to me," I whispered to Jake and Tommy, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. This could be salvation or disaster, and I had no way of knowing which. The driver who climbed down from the cab was built like a tree trunk. Big shoulders, thick arms, hands that looked like they could crack walnuts. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of deep tan that comes from years of highway driving. His high-vis shirt was dark with sweat, but he moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been helping stranded motorists for decades. "Bit of trouble?" His voice was gravelly but kind, and his eyes took in everything at once, the steam still rising from our engine, the 3 of us huddled together like refugees, the way I'd positioned myself between him and the boys. "Just overheated," I said, trying to sound casual and probably failing completely. "We'll be fine." The man, Mick, according to the name patch sewn onto his shirt, raised an eyebrow that suggested he'd heard that particular lie before. "In this heat? With kids?" He shook his head and moved toward our truck without waiting for permission. "You'll cook out here waiting for a tow. Let's have a look." I watched him examine our engine, noting how Jake crept closer despite my warnings to stay back. There was something about Mick that reminded me of Dad. That practical competence. The way he diagnosed problems without fuss or unnecessary drama. The careful gentleness he showed around the boys. "Couple of split hoses," Mick announced after a few minutes. "Fixable, if you've got some gaffer tape and water. Lucky for you I carry both." He glanced at us over the steaming engine bay and I caught something sharp and assessing in his expression. "Question is, where are you lot heading in such a hurry?" "Just visiting family," I said quickly. Too quickly. The words came out rushed and unconvincing, and I saw his eyes narrow slightly. Mick said nothing as he walked back to his truck, but I could feel him thinking. Processing details and inconsistencies. The way we were dressed, hastily thrown together clothes, no luggage except my school backpack. The way the boys stayed pressed close to me like they were scared of being separated. The fact that we were driving back roads in a truck that should have been retired years ago. My palms were slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. I'd rehearsed cover stories during the drive from Kondinin, but under pressure they all seemed flimsy as tissue paper. "He seems nice," Tommy whispered, but I shushed him automatically. Mick returned with a toolbox and a 5-liter water container, working efficiently to replace the worst of the damaged hoses with temporary patches. "This should get you mobile again," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Though you'll want to get it looked at properly when you reach town." "How far to the next town?" Jake asked, and I wanted to kick him for volunteering information. "Corrigan's about 40k that way," Mick pointed ahead down the empty road. "But if you're visiting family around here, shouldn't you already know where you're going?" The heat rose in my cheeks and I felt like a spotlight was shining on every lie I'd told. We don't visit often," I managed. "Right?" Mick's tone suggested he didn't believe a single word of it. He finished with the engine and straightened up, studying my face with the kind of attention that made me want to look away. "Mind if I ask how old you are, love?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Direct and unavoidable. 19, I said, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "And you're driving these boys where exactly?" "That's none of your business." The words snapped out sharper than I'd meant them to, and I saw Tommy flinch beside me. But Mick didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked sad. "Maybe not." He agreed quietly. "But I've got daughters of my own, and alarm bells are going off in my head right about now." He crouched down so he was at eye level with the boys, his expression gentle but serious. "You running from something, love?" he asked, looking directly at me. My mouth went dry as old leather. Everything in me wanted to deny it, to keep lying until he got back in his truck and drove away. But the kindness in his voice was undermining every defense I'd built. "No," I said. "We're just, because if you are, there might be better ways to handle it than driving kids through the backcountry in a busted truck with no supplies." "We're fine," I insisted, but my voice cracked on the words like I was 12 years old again. Beside me, Tommy was crying silently. Overwhelmed by the heat and the tension and the confusion of the last 24 hours. Small, exhausted tears that he tried to wipe away with the back of his hand. Mick noticed immediately. He crouched down to Tommy's level, his voice going even gentler. "Hey there, mate, what's your name?" Tommy looked at me uncertainly, remembering all the stranger danger talks Mum and Dad had given him over the years. "I'm not supposed to tell strangers," he said in a small voice. "That's good advice most of the time," Mick agreed seriously. "Your sister teaching you to be careful, is she?" Tommy nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "That's smart. Looking out for each other." Mick glanced at me, then back to Tommy. "You lot seem pretty close." "Mum and Dad got killed in a car crash," Tommy said suddenly, the words pouring out before I could stop them. "And now Sarah has to look after us, but the welfare people want to take us away and split us up, and we don't want to be split up." "Tommy." My voice was sharp with panic, but the damage was already done. Every secret I'd been trying to protect was lying there in the dust between us. Mick stood slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to understanding to something that might have been anger. But not at us. At the situation. At whatever had driven a 19-year-old girl to load her little brothers into a broken-down truck and run for the hills. "Jesus," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, kids. That's rough. Real rough." He looked at me with new eyes, still assessing but with sympathy now instead of suspicion. "How long ago?" he asked. I wanted to lie, but what was the point now? Tommy had already spilled everything that mattered. "Yesterday," I whispered. "And Child Services is already breathing down your necks?" "They were coming this morning, to collect them." The words came out bitter and angry. "To split them up and send them to strangers." Mick was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the shimmering horizon, where heat waves made everything look fluid and uncertain. "Where are you planning to go?" he asked finally. "My uncle had a property near Corrigan. He's dead now, but the place is still there, still belongs to the family." "And you think you can just hole up there indefinitely?" "I don't know." The words exploded out of me like steam from the radiator. "I don't know anything, okay?" I just know I can't let them put Tommy in foster care with strangers and send Jake somewhere else and pretend that's what Mum and Dad would have wanted. My voice was shaking now, all the fear and desperation I'd been holding back spilling out in front of this stranger who'd stopped to help us. Jake had been silent through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up with the serious tone he'd been using since our parents died. "Are you going to turn us in?" he asked directly. Mick considered this question seriously, which I had to respect. He could have lied to reassure a scared kid. Instead, he gave Jake the honesty he deserved. "I should probably call the police," he said slowly. "Let them know you're safe at least." "Please don't." My voice was barely a whisper now. "Please just give us a chance." "A chance to what? Live rough in an abandoned house with no money and no plan?" Mick shook his head. "That's not much of a life for kids, love." "It's better than being separated," I said fiercely. Something in my voice must have reached him, because his expression softened around the edges. "Look, I get it," he said quietly. "I really do. But running away like this, it's only going to make things harder when they do find you, and they will find you sooner or later. Maybe, but at least we'll have been together." Mick stared at me for a long time, and I felt like he was weighing things I couldn't see, measuring my desperation against his own sense of responsibility, trying to decide if I was a good sister making bad choices, or just another kid who'd lost her way. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Your uncle's place, that'd be the old Henderson station, would it?" I nodded, surprised he knew it. "Ray Henderson was a good bloke," Mick said slowly. "Hard worker. Helped me out of a jam more than once when I was getting started on these roads." He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Place has been empty for what, 3 years now? About that. It's not going to be livable, you know. No power, no phone. Bore water's probably contaminated by now, and it's not exactly hidden. Anyone looking for you will check family properties eventually." "I know," I said. "But it buys us time." "Time for what?" I didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't thought beyond getting the boys away from Kondinin and the immediate threat of separation. The future was a black hole I couldn't bear to examine too closely. Mick seemed to understand my silence. "All right," he said finally. "I'll make you a deal. I won't call the cops today, but if I don't hear from you in a week, if I don't know you're safe and managing okay, I'm calling them myself." "Fair enough." The relief was so overwhelming, I nearly started crying right there. "Thank you," I managed. "Don't thank me yet," Mick said grimly. "You might wish I'd hauled you all back to town when you see what you're walking into out there." He handed me a business card, creased and grimy from his wallet. "That's got my mobile number on it. You call me if you need help, yeah? Any kind of help. Food, supplies, medical emergency, whatever. I run this route twice a week, so I'm never too far away." He finished topping up our radiator and watched as I coaxed the truck back to life. The engine sounded rough but willing, and the temperature gauge held steady as we pulled back onto the bitumen. "Remember," Mick called after us through the open passenger window. 1 week. You call me in 1 week or I call the cops. Deal?" "Deal." I called back, though I wasn't sure what I'd tell him when that week was up. The old Henderson station appeared through the scrub like a monument to dashed hopes. The house was weatherboard and corrugated iron, built back when people still believed the wheat belt was going to make them rich. But prosperity had passed this place by decades ago, and now the veranda sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect. Several windows were boarded up with sheets of rust-streaked iron. The garden that Uncle Ray's wife had once tended was a tangle of weeds and wild roses gone feral. Paint peeled from the weatherboards in long strips, curling away from the timber like old sunburned skin. I parked the truck in the shade of what had once been a pepper tree, now dead and skeletal against the harsh blue sky. Tried to hide my dismay as I looked at what was supposed to be our sanctuary. "This is it?" Jake's voice carried all the skepticism I was feeling. I'd visited here twice as a child, and remembered it differently, rambling but comfortable, full of Uncle Ray's working dogs and the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen stove. The reality was far grimmer than my childhood memories. "It just needs some work," I said, but even Tommy looked doubtful. The front door was hanging open, the lock broken. probably by vandals or scavengers looking for anything worth taking. Inside, the house felt like a furnace that had been baking in the sun for years. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated gaps in the boarded windows. Animal droppings littered the floors, mice, maybe rats, possibly something larger. The kitchen cupboards hung open like hungry mouths, revealing nothing but cobwebs and the brown stains of water damage. But we weren't the first people to find this place. Recent beer cans sat on the kitchen table, labels faded but not ancient. A sleeping bag was rolled up in what had been Uncle Ray's bedroom. Someone had been using this house as a crash pad, and recently. "Sarah?" Tommy's voice was small and scared. "I don't like it here." Neither did I, but we were committed now. The truck was nearly out of petrol, and we had nowhere else to go. "It'll be better once we clean it up and get some air moving through," I said, trying to inject confidence I didn't feel into my voice. I set the boys to work opening windows while I took inventory of our situation. The power had been disconnected years ago, but there were gas bottles connected to the old stove. I turned the valve and was rewarded with the hiss of escaping gas. Not much pressure, but maybe enough for cooking. The bore pump in the yard wasn't working, but there was an old hand pump that might draw water, though Mick's warning about contamination worried me. We'd have to boil everything, just to be safe. As the day wore on, we managed to make the kitchen and one bedroom barely habitable. I found some old curtains in a linen closet to replace the corrugated iron over the windows, let in light while maintaining some privacy from anyone who might come looking. Jake proved surprisingly handy with a broom and dustpan, attacking the mouse droppings with grim determination. Tommy appointed himself supervisor of our meager supplies, arranging our few cans of food on the kitchen shelves with the seriousness of a quartermaster. By evening, exhaustion had caught up with all of us. I managed to heat a can of baked beans on the gas stove, and we ate in silence around the old kitchen table. Too tired for conversation, too overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd taken on. Outside, the bush was coming alive with night sounds, the distant call of a mopoke owl, the rustle of small animals in the scrub. Sounds that would have been comforting back home but seemed ominous here in our isolation. "I want to go home," Tommy said quietly, poking at his beans with a bent spoon. "This is home now," I replied, but the words felt hollow even to me. That night, I lay awake on the musty mattress we'd dragged from Uncle Ray's old room, listening to Tommy's restless sleep and Jake's careful breathing. Every sound outside made me tense. Was that a car engine in the distance, footsteps on the veranda, or just the old house settling into the cool of the night? Dawn came without incident, but it brought new challenges and the growing weight of responsibility. How long could we make our food last? What would happen when the gas bottles ran empty? How would we manage when the boys were supposed to be back at school? Questions I couldn't answer, piling up like storm clouds on the horizon. The third day brought Sergeant Collins. I saw the police car coming from a long way off, a white speck raising dust against the blue haze distance. I'd been hanging our few clothes on a makeshift line behind the house, trying to wash the smell of the road and our fear out of the fabric. My first instinct was to run, to grab the boys and disappear into the scrub. But there was nowhere to go, and Jake and Tommy were inside making sandwiches from our dwindling supplies. Running would only make us look more guilty than we already were. "Jake," I called, keeping my voice level despite the panic climbing my throat. "Come here for a minute." He appeared in the doorway, took one look at my face, and understood immediately. "Police?" he asked quietly. "Yeah. Stay calm and let me do the talking. Don't volunteer anything they don't specifically ask for." The police car pulled up beside our truck, and a middle-aged man in uniform climbed out slowly. He was tall and lean with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his career in country towns. Gray hair beneath his cap, pale eyes that missed nothing, expression professionally neutral as he approached. "Afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sergeant Collins, Corrigan Station. Mind if I ask what brings you out to Ray Henderson's old place?" My mouth felt like I'd been eating sand, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Just having a look around. My dad was Ray's nephew." "Was he now?" Collins' pale eye studied my face with uncomfortable intensity. "And your dad would be?" "Michael Walsh." It wasn't entirely a lie. Dad had used Uncle Ray's surname professionally sometimes when it suited him. Right, and you are? Sarah, this is Jake. I gestured to my brother, who had appeared beside me with Tommy close behind, like a small shadow. Collins nodded to the boys, his gaze lingering on Tommy's thin face and two serious eyes, the way we all stood pressed together like we were expecting bad news. Bit remote out here for a family visit, he observed mildly. We like the quiet. I bet you do. Collins walked over to examine our truck, noting the patched radiator hoses and the general wear that spoke of hard use and deferred maintenance. How long are you planning to stay? Haven't decided yet. Collins nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected. Thing is, Sarah, I had an interesting call yesterday from my colleagues over in Kondinin. Seems there are some kids missing from that way. 3 of them, 2 boys and their older sister, family name of Walsh. My heart stopped beating for a moment, but I forced myself to meet his gaze without flinching. Is that right? It is. Tragic situation apparently. Parents killed in a car accident, and the kids disappeared before child services could arrange proper care. Collins' voice remained conversational, but his eyes never left my face. Real shame when something like that happens. Kids probably scared, don't understand how the system works to protect them. That does sound awful, I agreed carefully. Of course, the thing about missing kids is that everyone gets worried about them. Social workers, distant relatives, police from 3 different districts. He glanced meaningfully at the house behind us, taking in the boarded windows and general state of neglect. Makes for a lot of people asking questions, checking likely hiding spots, remote properties belonging to deceased relatives, that sort of thing. Jake shifted beside me, and I could feel his tension like heat from a radiator. Tommy had gone very still, the way he always did when adults were angry or upset. I can imagine that would keep you busy, I said. Collins nodded gravely. Funny thing though, I called over to Kondinin this morning, and apparently one of their missing kids is named Sarah Walsh, 19 years old, works at the pub in town. Has 2 younger brothers called Jake and Tommy. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled tight. In the distance, a crow called harshly from the dead pepper tree, the sound sharp and mocking in the still air. That is quite a coincidence, I said finally, isn't it just to? Collins smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Tell you what though, these kids I'm looking for, I don't think they're bad kids. I think they're scared kids, who've made a decision that seems right to them, but might not be the smartest thing in the long run. He walked closer, close enough that I could see the lines around his eyes and smell the coffee on his breath. I had to fight the urge to step backward. Now, if I was to find these kids, Collins continued slowly, I'd want to make sure they understood that running away doesn't solve anything. Just makes the grown-ups more worried, and the eventual outcome more complicated. He paused, letting that sink in. But I'd also want them to know that there are people willing to listen. People willing to help them find a better solution than hiding out in abandoned houses where anything could happen to them. That sounds very reasonable. I managed through a throat that felt like it was closing up. I like to think so. Collins looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on Tommy's upturned face. Course, I'd also have to explain that child welfare laws exist for good reasons. And that 19-year-old sisters, no matter how well-meaning, aren't automatically considered suitable guardians. The words hit me like physical blows, but I kept my expression as neutral as I could manage. Still, Collins added thoughtfully, courts have been known to make exceptions when it's clearly in the children's best interests. Especially when the alternative guardian can demonstrate stability and genuine support from the community. He walked back toward his car with deliberate slowness, then turned back to face us. I'll probably swing by again in a day or 2, he said casually. Check on whoever's staying out here, make sure they're managing okay. Isolated places like this can be dangerous, contaminated bore water, faulty gas fittings, old floorboards giving way, that sort of thing. His gaze found mine and held it. Be a real shame if anything happened to anyone camping out here. We'll be careful, I said. I'm sure you will. Collins climbed into his car, but before closing the door, he leaned out the window one more time. Oh, and Sarah? That missing girl from Kondinin? If you happen to run into her, you might mention that her Aunt Linda from Perth has been calling the police station every few hours. Seems she's very keen to help with arrangements for those missing boys, has some pretty strong opinions about what's best for them. The police car disappeared in its own dust cloud, leaving us standing in the yard like survivors of some natural disaster. My legs felt shaky, and I sat down heavily on the front steps. "He knows," Jake said quietly. "Yeah, he knows. But he didn't arrest us." "No, not yet." I buried my face in my hands, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down like a physical thing. "He's giving us a warning. A chance to come in voluntarily before this gets any worse." "Are we going to?" Tommy asked, climbing onto the step beside me. I looked at my little brother, really looked at him. He'd lost weight in the few days since our parents died, and his clothes hung loose on his small frame. There were dark circles under his eyes from nightmares and disrupted sleep. His hair needed cutting, and there was a hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of too much stress and not enough proper meals. This wasn't the life I'd wanted to give him. This wasn't saving him at all. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I really don't know anymore." The accident happened 2 hours after Sergeant Collins left. I was inside trying to get more pressure out of the failing gas burner when I heard Jake scream, not the ordinary yell of surprise or frustration, but the raw, desperate sound of real pain and terror. I dropped everything and ran outside, my heart already hammering with fresh panic. I found him crumpled at the base of the old windmill, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle that made my stomach lurch. He must have climbed up to check the mechanism like I'd asked him to, and one of the rusted iron rungs had given way under his weight. Pieces of corroded metal lay scattered around him like shrapnel. "Don't move," I said, dropping to my knees beside him on the hard-packed earth. "Jake, don't try to move at all." His face was white with shock, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool of the late afternoon. When he tried to speak, his voice came out thin and strained. "It hurts, Sarah. God, it really hurts." I could see the break through his torn jeans, a clean snap of the tibia, the bone pressing hard against the skin but not quite breaking through. Blood was seeping from scrapes and cuts where he'd hit the ground, but the real problem was the angle of his leg. This wasn't something I could fix with first aid and wishful thinking. Tommy stood frozen a few feet away, his mouth open in horror, tears already streaming down his cheeks. "Tommy, go get the first aid kit from the truck," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "And bring me those old sheets from inside, the clean ones we found yesterday." My hands were shaking as I examined Jake's leg more closely. I'd done basic first aid training when I started at the pub, workplace safety requirements, but this was beyond anything they'd taught us. The leg needed to be set properly, x-rayed, probably put in a cast. Jake needed a hospital, and he needed it now. "We have to go back, don't we?" Jake said, through gritted teeth, reading the truth in my face. "Sarah, we have to call for help." "I know," I whispered, the words tearing at my throat. "I know we do." The drive to the regional hospital in Narrogin took 45 minutes that felt like hours. I'd fashioned a makeshift splint from broken fence posts and torn sheets, trying to remember everything I'd ever learned about stabilizing fractures. But every bump in the rough road made Jake cry out, his face going gray with pain. Tommy sat beside him in the back seat, holding his brother's hand and whispering reassurances that sounded like prayers. "It's okay, Jake. Sarah's taking us somewhere they can fix it, it's going to be okay." But his voice was shaking as badly as mine. "What if they arrest us?" Tommy asked as the hospital lights came into view through the gathering dusk. "They won't arrest you," I said firmly. "Whatever happens to me, they won't blame you boys for any of this. This is all on me." The emergency department was a blur of bright fluorescent lights and urgent voices. A triage nurse took one look at Jake's improvised splint and the pain etched into his features, then rushed him straight through to a treatment room. I started to follow, but a gentle hand touched my shoulder. "Are you the guardian?" asked a middle-aged woman in civilian clothes. Not medical staff. Something about her careful, observant manner, and the way she positioned herself between me and the treatment area, screamed social services. "I'm his sister," I said, my mouth going dry. "I see. And your parents are?" The question I'd been dreading, delivered with professional sympathy but unrelenting purpose. "They died last week, car accident near Kondinin." The woman's expression shifted to practiced compassion, but her eyes remained alert and assessing. "I'm Margaret Ross, hospital social worker. We'll need to notify the appropriate authorities, of course, there's been quite a bit of concern about your whereabouts." "Is Jake going to be okay?" I interrupted, not wanting to hear about authorities or concerns or any of the bureaucratic machinery that was about to grind us up. "The doctors are examining him now. It looks like a clean break. Painful, but not life-threatening. He should make a full recovery." Margaret gestured toward a small office off the main corridor. "Perhaps we could have a chat while we wait for the X-ray results." I knew this was it. The moment I'd been running from since that first terrible phone call. The end of our brief, desperate attempt at staying together. But Jake needed medical care, and that mattered more than my freedom or my pride. The office was cramped but designed to be comforting. Children's drawings on the walls, a box of tissues prominently placed on the desk, 2 chairs positioned at angles that suggested conversation rather than interrogation. Margaret closed the door quietly and settled across from me, pulling out a thick manila folder. "You're Sarah Henderson, aren't you?" she said without preamble. 19 years old, from Kondinin? There was no point in lying anymore. The charade was over. "Yes. There are quite a lot of people who've been looking for you. Child Protection Services, your aunt in Perth, police departments in 3 different districts." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her manner professional but not unkind. "Everyone's been very worried about you and the boys." "I just wanted to keep us together," I said, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. "I couldn't let them split us up and send us to strangers." "Tell me about that. What made you think that's what would happen?" So I told her everything. About Mrs. Henderson's gentle warnings about how the system really worked. About Aunt Linda in Adelaide, who'd married money and moved away from everything that reminded her of her wheat-belt childhood. About the fear that had driven me to pack up my brothers and run into the bush like some kind of desperate animal. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a neat, precise hand. "I understand why you were frightened," she said when I finished. "The system can seem overwhelming and impersonal, especially when you're grieving and trying to process so much loss at once." "But you're going to split us up anyway," I said dully. "Actually, that's not necessarily true." Margaret opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "I've been making some calls since you arrived here tonight. Your Aunt Linda has withdrawn her application for custody." I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "What?" "Apparently she's had time to reconsider the realities of taking on 2 traumatized children when she has no experience with kids, and a lifestyle that wouldn't accommodate their needs. She's agreed to provide financial support if needed, but she no longer wants physical custody." "So what happens now?" I asked, afraid to hope. Margaret smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from any official in over a week. "Now we explore your options. Guardianship applications by siblings aren't common, but they're not unheard of either, especially when the children themselves express such a strong preference to stay together, and when there's clear evidence of genuine family bonds." "You mean I could actually?" "There would be conditions, of course. Regular home visits, demonstrated financial stability, character references from people willing to vouch for your ability to provide proper care. And you'd need to complete some parenting courses, show that you understand child development and safety issues." I thought about Sergeant Collins and his parting words. The way he'd looked at me with something that might have been grudging respect. Maybe even Mick, the truckie who'd helped us on the road and seemed to understand what drove people to desperate choices. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "A family court hearing was scheduled for next week to determine temporary custody arrangements. Initially it was going to be about placing the boys in emergency foster care while we sorted out the family situation. But I can petition to have it changed to consider your guardianship application instead." Hope flared in my chest like a struck match, dangerous and bright and terrifying. "What are our chances?" I asked. Margaret considered this carefully. "Honestly, it depends on several factors. Your age works against you. 19 is very young to take on full parental responsibility. But your obvious relationship with the boys and their clear attachment to you works strongly in your favor." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The judge will want to be convinced that this arrangement truly serves their best interests, not just your emotional needs. You'll need to demonstrate maturity, stability, and a realistic understanding of what you're taking on." A soft knock interrupted us. A young doctor peered around the door, still wearing scrubs. "The boys are asking for their sister," he said with a tired smile. "Jake's leg is set and casted." Clean break, should heal perfectly. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation and pain management, but he should be able to go home tomorrow. Can I see them? I asked, standing up quickly. Of course. Room 12, just down the hall. I found Jake propped up in a narrow hospital bed, his left leg encased in a bright blue fiberglass cast that looked enormous against his thin frame. Tommy was curled up in a vinyl chair beside the bed, finally asleep after the stress and fear of the afternoon. Both boys looked small and vulnerable under the harsh hospital lighting. How do you feel? I asked softly, pulling another chair close to Jake's bedside. Better, much better. His voice was drowsy from pain medication, but clearer than it had been since the accident. Those drugs they gave me are pretty amazing. I sat on the edge of the bed and took his uninjured hand in both of mine. His fingers were warm and solid, real, present, safe for now. Jake, I need to tell you something. About what happens next. Are we in trouble? Real trouble this time? Not the way I thought we would be, not exactly. I squeezed his hand gently. There might be a way for us to stay together, legally I mean. But it's going to be complicated, and there are no guarantees. Jake's eyes sharpened, despite the medication. What kind of way? I could apply to be your legal guardian, yours and Tommy's. It would mean going to court, having people examine our lives, proving that I can take proper care of you both. Can you take proper care of us, I mean? The question was so direct, so serious, that it took my breath away. Jake wasn't asking for false reassurance. He was asking for the truth, and he deserved to get it. I don't know, I said honestly. I'm still figuring out how to take care of myself most of the time. But I love you both more than anything in the world, and I'm willing to learn whatever I need to learn. Jake squeezed my hand with surprising strength. We can do it, he said with the fierce certainty of someone who'd already survived the worst thing he could imagine. The three of us together, we can do anything. I hoped he was right. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, but not as intimidating as the government buildings I'd imagined from television. I sat at a table beside the legal aid lawyer Margaret had helped me find, watching as various officials took their seats and shuffled through manila folders full of our life story reduced to bureaucratic summaries. Jake was beside me on crutches, his bright blue cast a splash of color in the somber room. He'd insisted on wearing his best shirt, the one Mum had bought him for last year's school photos, and had combed his hair with more care than I'd seen since our parents died. Tommy sat on my other side, wearing the cleanest clothes we could manage and looking simultaneously scared and determined. His small hand was clamped around mine with surprising strength. The judge was a middle-aged woman, with graying hair pulled back severely and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up from her papers as the clerk called our case. This is a guardianship hearing for Jake William Henderson, age 12, and Thomas Michael Henderson, age 8, she said in a clear, carrying voice. The applicant is Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, age 19, sister to the minors. She fixed me with a direct look that somehow managed to be both stern and encouraging. Ms. Henderson, you understand that you're seeking legal guardianship of your brothers following the tragic death of your parents? Yes, Your Honor. My voice came out steadier than I'd dared hope. And you understand the full scope of responsibilities this would entail? You would be legally responsible for their physical welfare, their education, their medical care, and their general upbringing until they reach the age of majority. I understand. This is not a temporary arrangement or a trial period. If granted, this guardianship would make you, in effect, their parent in the eyes of the law. Do you understand the permanence and gravity of what you're requesting? Yes, Your Honor, I do. The next hour passed like a carefully choreographed dance. The Child Protection Services caseworker testified about our family situation, the boys' clear preference to remain together, and her assessment that I demonstrated genuine commitment to their welfare. She recommended that I be given the opportunity to prove myself as guardian, subject to regular monitoring and support services. Margaret took the stand to outline the home study she'd conducted, the parenting courses I'd already enrolled in, and her professional opinion that this arrangement could work with proper oversight. Then came the character witnesses. Sergeant Collins looked uncomfortable in his formal dress uniform, but he spoke clearly about my resourcefulness and obvious devotion to my brothers. He also noted my poor judgment in running away, but framed it as the desperate act of a young person who felt she had no other options. To my surprise and gratitude, Mick had driven down from his current run in Kalgoorlie. He testified briefly, but powerfully about our encounter on the road, my protective instincts, and the boys' absolute trust in me. When the judge asked him why he'd chosen to help us instead of immediately calling authorities, his answer was simple and direct. Because sometimes scared kids need someone to believe in them long enough for them to figure out the right thing to do. Finally, the judge asked to speak with Jake and Tommy privately. They disappeared with her into her chambers for 20 minutes that felt like hours. When they returned, both boys looked serious but not distressed. The court recognizes that this is a highly unusual situation, quote, the judge said when everyone was seated again. Ms. Henderson, you are very young to take on such significant responsibilities. Under normal circumstances, we would prefer to place minor children with more mature guardians, or in specialized foster care designed to meet their specific needs. My heart began to sink. However, she continued, and I felt Jake tense beside me, it is abundantly clear that you and your brothers have an exceptionally strong family bond. Both boys have articulated their desire to remain in your care with remarkable maturity and conviction. The professional assessments suggest that this arrangement could indeed serve their best interests, given adequate support systems. She paused, looking directly at me over her glasses. I am prepared to grant you temporary guardianship for a period of 6 months, subject to strict conditions. I could barely breathe. You must establish and maintain stable housing appropriate for children. You must secure and maintain steady employment sufficient to meet their material needs. You must ensure that both boys attend school regularly and receive any necessary medical care or counseling services. A qualified Boydische social worker will conduct monthly home visits and file detailed reports with this court, and you must successfully complete an accredited parenting skills program within the next 90 days. She leaned forward slightly. Ms. Henderson, I want to be absolutely clear about what this means. You have 6 months to prove beyond any doubt that this arrangement serves your brothers' best interests. If you can demonstrate stability, maturity, and genuine capability as their guardian, we will consider making this arrangement permanent. If you cannot, she let the implication hang in the air. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jake grabbed my hand under the table, squeezing so tightly it hurt. Tommy was crying quietly beside me, whether from relief or residual fear I couldn't tell. As we left the courthouse, Margaret caught up with us on the stone steps. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. There's a rental house available in Narrogin, she said without preamble. 2 bedrooms, walking distance to both the primary and high schools. The landlord is a friend of mine. He's willing to work with you on the deposit and first month's rent. How did you? It's my job to help families succeed, Sarah, not just process them through the system. She handed me a business card with her direct phone number written on it in pen. Call me if you need anything at all. Practical help, someone to talk to, emergency support, anything. And remember, you didn't just save your brothers today. You gave all 3 of you a chance at a real future together. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since this all began, it felt like someone in authority was genuinely on our side. Oh, and Sarah, you did the right thing bringing Jake to the hospital when he was injured. Running away showed poor judgment, but knowing when to come back and ask for help, that showed real wisdom. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our little rental house in Narrogin, packing school lunches and trying to referee an argument between Jake and Tommy about whose turn it was to feed our new kitten. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, filled with the familiar chaos of getting 2 boys ready for another day of classes. Sarah, Tommy put Vegemite in my sandwich and I hate Vegemite, Jake complained, waving the offending sandwich in the air. Then make your own bloody sandwich, I replied without looking up from the stack of bills I was sorting through. You're 13 years old, not 3. Language, Tommy said primly, which made me snort with laughter. My job at the local pub barely covered our expenses, but we were managing. More than managing, we were building something that felt sustainable and real. The boys were both doing well in their new schools. Jake had made the cricket team despite his leg injury, and Tommy had discovered a talent for art that kept him happily occupied for hours. The social worker's final report had been filed the week before, recommending that my guardianship be made permanent. Margaret had called to let me know the judge would make the official ruling within the month, but she'd assured me it was essentially a formality at this point. We'd proven ourselves, apparently. Demonstrated that love and determination could sometimes trump age and inexperience. Sarah? Tommy appeared at my elbow, school bag slung over one shoulder, and our kitten tucked under his other arm. Can Whiskers come to school with me today? Absolutely not. Put the cat down and grab your lunch from the counter. Sometimes, usually late at night when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, I thought about that terrible phone call that had started everything. How young and terrified I'd been at 19, how certain that the world was ending and taking everything good with it. In some ways that world had ended. The easy, protected childhood we'd all shared was gone forever, along with the luxury of believing that parents would always be there to solve problems and make hard decisions. But what we'd built to replace it was entirely our own. Earned through mistakes and small victories, held together by stubbornness and the absolute refusal to let go of each other when letting go would have been easier. Ready for school? I asked, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. Ready, Jake said, swinging his backpack over his shoulder with practiced ease. Tommy hugged me around the waist, a gesture that had become our daily ritual. Love you, Sarah. Love you too, little man. As we walked toward the car in the mild autumn sunshine, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd looked over my shoulder, checking for pursuit. We weren't running anymore. We weren't hiding. We were just living the way families do, one ordinary day at a time. The phone rang while I was loading the dishwasher after dinner, and for just a moment my hands froze over the plates. Even now, 10 months after the court hearing, unexpected calls could still make my heart race with phantom panic. I'll get it, Jake said, reaching for the handset with the casual confidence of someone who no longer expected every ring to bring disaster. Hello, yeah, she's here. He held out the phone with a grin. It's Margaret. I dried my hands on the tea towel, accepting the phone with a smile that felt completely natural now. Margaret's calls had evolved from official check-ins to something that felt almost like friendship, though I suspected she would always carry a professional concern for our little makeshift family. Sarah, I have news. Margaret's voice was warm with satisfaction. The judge signed the final papers this afternoon. It's official. You're their permanent legal guardian. Congratulations. The words hit me like a physical thing, solid and real, in a way that months of temporary orders and probationary periods had never quite been. I sank into one of our mismatched kitchen chairs, suddenly boneless with relief and joy and something that might have been triumph. Sarah, are you still there? I'm here. I managed through a throat that had gone tight with emotion. It's really over? The uncertainty, I mean? It's really over. You'll receive the official documents in the mail, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. You've done something remarkable, Sarah. You should be very proud. After Margaret hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the ordinary sounds of my brothers in the living room. Tommy practicing his reading aloud, stumbling occasionally over longer words. Jake helping him with patient encouragement, the two of them curled up together on our second-hand couch. The evening news murmuring from our small television, full of distant troubles that couldn't touch us here in our warm, cluttered sanctuary. I thought about calling someone else to share the news, then realized I wasn't entirely sure who. Mrs. Henderson had moved to Perth to live with her daughter. Mick was somewhere on the highways between here and Darwin, probably wouldn't be through Narrogin for weeks. Sergeant Collins might appreciate knowing how things had worked out, but it felt presumptuous to bother him at home just to share good news. The isolation of it struck me, not lonely exactly, but the recognition that our little family had become its own complete universe. We'd built something that didn't need outside validation to exist, though it was satisfying to have the law finally catch up with what we'd known all along. Sarah. Tommy appeared in the doorway, still holding his reading book, looking concerned. Are you sad about something? You look like you might cry. No, little man, just thinking. I opened my arms, and he climbed into my lap, all sharp elbows and bony knees, and the lingering smell of the soap I made him use after playing in the backyard. Actually, I have some really good news. Remember how we were waiting for the judge to make his final decision about our family? Tommy nodded solemnly. At 9 he understood more about bureaucracy and legal proceedings than most kids his age, though he wore that knowledge lightly. Well, he decided today, we get to stay together forever now. Officially and permanently. Tommy considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. We were going to do that anyway, he said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. Yeah, I agreed, kissing the top of his head where his hair still smelled like the strawberry shampoo he insisted on using. We absolutely were. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, having heard enough of our conversation to understand what had happened. At 13, he'd developed Dad's way of showing emotion through actions rather than words. He walked over and wrapped his long arms around both of us, awkward with the growth spurt that had hit him over the summer but determined to make the gesture count. We sat like that for several minutes, a tangle of limbs and relief and quiet joy in the warm light of our kitchen. Outside, Narragain was settling into another peaceful evening. Porch lights coming on along our street. The distant sound of someone starting a lawnmower to catch the last good light. The normal sounds of a normal place where normal families live normal lives. Later, after both boys had gone to bed, I found myself standing in our small backyard with a cup of tea, looking up at stars that seemed brighter and closer than they'd ever been in Kondinin. The night air carried the scent of the neighbor's jasmine vine and the faint sounds of the highway that ran past the edge of town, trucks heading north toward Perth or south toward Albany, carrying people and cargo toward destinations that had nothing to do with us. I tried to remember what it had felt like to want to be on one of those trucks, heading anywhere that wasn't here. The desperation of that day when our truck broke down in the middle of nowhere seemed like something that had happened to someone else entirely. Though I could still see the scar on my palm where I'd gripped the steering wheel so tightly that Mum's ring, now properly mine, had cut into the skin. The ring was still too big for my finger, but I'd stopped thinking of it as borrowed. Like everything else in our life, it had become mine through the simple act of refusing to let go. Sarah? I turned to find Jake at the back door, wearing the oversized rugby jersey he'd taken to sleeping in. Can't sleep. He shrugged, joining me on the small concrete patio our landlord generously called a deck. Just thinking about stuff. Good stuff or bad stuff? Both, I guess. Jake was quiet for a moment, watching a plane blink its way across the sky toward Perth. Do you ever wonder if Mum and Dad would be proud of how we turned out? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, we all thought about our parents regularly, but because Jake so rarely voiced those deeper thoughts aloud. I think they'd be amazed by how strong you and Tommy have been, I said carefully. I think Dad would probably tease me about becoming such a warrior, and Mum would definitely have opinions about my housekeeping standards. Jake smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his serious face. Our mother had been house-proud in the way of women who'd grown up with very little and married into something better. Everything always clean and in its proper place, clothes folded with military precision. Do you remember how she used to lay out our school clothes the night before? Jake asked. Every shirt ironed perfectly, even just for wearing to Kondinin Primary. I remember. I keep meaning to do that for you and Tommy, but somehow Sunday night rolls around and I'm throwing clean clothes at you from the laundry basket and calling it good enough. We don't mind. Tommy likes picking his own combinations anyway, even when they don't match at all. Especially when they don't match. That kid has absolutely no color sense whatsoever. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the weight of memory and the strange comfort of being the only people in the world who remembered our parents exactly as they had been. Not idealized or diminished by time and grief, just human and missed and deeply loved. Sarah? Jake's voice was smaller now, more like the scared 12-year-old he'd been on that terrible night. Are you ever sorry? About taking us on, I mean. About giving up your own life for this? The question hung in the cool night air between us, heavy with all the things we'd never quite said aloud. I felt the old instinct to deflect, to offer easy reassurance that would smooth over the complexity of what we'd all sacrificed and gained. But Jake was old enough now for the complete truth, and he deserved to hear it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices, I said slowly. What my life might have looked like if I'd let the system take you and Tommy, if I'd gone to the city like I'd always planned. Jake went very still beside me, but I've never been sorry about the choice I actually made. I continued firmly. Not once, not even on the hardest days. Even when Tommy had nightmares every single